Well, hi there, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Shaun McMahon, host of the Your Health podcast, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Experts. Today, we're talking about COVID-19 variants, vaccination, the fourth wave, and of course, back to school. And I'm joined by Dr. Leighanne Parkes, microbiologist and infectious disease specialist at the Jewish General Hospital. Dr. Parkes, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Je vous rappelle également que plus tard cette semaine, nous allons avoir une séance d'information en français avec le docteur Yves Lontin pour répondre à vos questions sur la quatrième vague, les variants, le retour à l'école et beaucoup plus. So we've been getting a lot of questions, as I know you have, in the halls, roaming around the JGH. A lot of similar concerns lately, right? I thought it was a great time to jump on and do another episode like this to address some of those concerns. Let's start, if we could, with the fourth wave. It's underway. The numbers don't lie. They've been climbing up again. We're seeing more and more COVID cases. What does that mean, first of all, for the community? How is it affecting hospital admissions? And how does vaccination play a role in what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, I think those are all really great questions and probably ones that don't have firm answers. We're a bit in uncharted territory right now. This is the first real wave we've had since we have a substantial portion of the population that's vaccinated, fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated. So how this is really going to play out in terms of hospitalizations, ICU admissions, deaths, a number of cases is still yet to be determined. And there's a lot of factors that might influence what the next few months look like. Certainly we are in our fourth wave, and certainly we see other jurisdictions worldwide that are experiencing the same surge in cases. And this is not unexpected because we do see this as being driven by a variant that I'm sure you've all heard about on the news, Delta. So just to sort of unpackage that a bit, Delta variant is a COVID virus that basically has a few really important mutations that make it a bit of a dangerous guy. So one of those mutations is within its receptor binding site. And the receptor binding site is exactly where the virus attaches to our cells. So these complex of mutations allow it to do so with greater affinity. So it's like, being out on the street and you see Danny DeVito versus Brad Pitt, you're going to gravitate towards Brad Pitt with greater affinity.
I know I would.
You're going to latch onto him, and then restraining orders are going to be, that's aside.
With all due respect to Danny DeVito, who I'm a big fan, he's very funny, but that's besides the point.
And I'm sure if I was a different cell, I would also gravitate towards Danny DeVito, but I'm a respiratory cell that has ACE receptors. So I'm going for Brad Pitt there. So because of that, it binds with greater affinity. And then there's a few other mutations that are really important, some of which are in different areas. One's called a superantigen site, which sounds really exciting, but it's basically where our immune cells or our antibodies attach to deactivate the virus. And once you have changes here, it can lead to a little bit of escape from our immune system. So if we were previously infected and we have antibodies, they might not recognize it as well. And similarly, if you have vaccine-derived antibodies, they might not recognize it as well. And there's also another mutation in something called like a furin cleavage site. So it's the part that breaks apart the spike protein and allows the virus to enter the cell. And if you compare it to the Wuhan strain, our ancestral guy, the number of primed spike proteins on viruses when we were exposed to them is about 10%, alpha 50%, and delta 75%. Wow. So all this is to say it's an incredibly infectious and the fastest and fittest virus or variant that we've seen so far in the pandemic.
So let me ask you a question though, because in real terms, right? So how is the Delta different in terms of how contagious it really is if I'm at the grocery store, for example, in real everyday scenarios versus regular old COVID and now the Delta variant, for example, how much more contagious is it?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the data we have coming out, looking at retrospective studies, some other analyses, depending on the jurisdiction that's publishing, compared to Alpha, which is the UK variant, the one that we have or had predominantly transmitting here within Montreal, you're looking somewhere between 40 to 72% more transmissible.
Okay.
If you compare it to non-variants of concern, you're looking at 97% increased transmissibility. So this also causes greater number of cases, secondary cases. So its secondary attack rate is 64% versus 6 to 10% of ancestral strains. And it also it increases more virus. So it's about a greater than 1,000 times more virus in the nose and the respiratory tract of an infected person. So it's not surprising that it's going to spread with greater ease. And it's not surprising that what we're seeing across the world is a fourth wave that's completely fueled by Delta, with cases that are increasing exponentially. But what we're not seeing in some places is increased risks of hospitalization and severity. And that could be because of the effective vaccine.
So let's talk about the vaccination aspect of that, because we got a question from Jessica via DM, and thanks for all your questions. We'll get to a few of those, of course, particularly about the Delta variant. She wants to know, how protected am I from COVID variant if I've been vaccinated, which of course is the root of the question. But talk to us about the importance of both doses, because we've seen some people get one and then say, well, I'm good. That's enough. I've done my due diligence. But how important are the 2 doses in terms of how protected we are against COVID, but especially in terms of these variants that are more worrisome at the moment?
So 2 doses are incredibly important. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head here with that. So what we're seeing so far from our Delta data is that not only is Delta more apt to create severe disease in unvaccinated individuals, having 2 doses of vaccine are more likely to protect you from severe disease and even symptomatic disease. So what we see is, although our immune response might be less vigorous with when we have vaccine and are met with Delta, we're still protected if we have our 2 doses. So the estimated vaccine efficacy for Delta with Pfizer and Moderna is greater than 80% after 2 doses. Comparatively, for 1 dose, you're looking at close to 60%, 50, 60%. Okay. So that's not good. The reduction in vaccine efficacy with Delta is 18% with just 1 dose of reduction versus only 8% with 2 doses. So if you really want to protect yourself, like, go out there, get both doses of vaccine. That's absolutely going to protect you from severity and which includes hospitalization and death. That is retained with our vaccine, and it will even protect you against getting symptomatic disease. So having that pretty uncomfortable experience of having COVID.
And, there were times over the course of this pandemic where vaccine availability was maybe a little bit touch and go at times, but it's become really easy and really available too now. So that's the thing. There are so many places and times and ways you can get, whether it's at a permanent vaccination site on our territory, or, there's mobile vaccination sites. There's our Vaxi van that goes from park to park in some cases. So it's easy enough to get those both doses. Got a question from Stefan here, who's one of our social workers in CUS West Central, wants to know if somebody who received their 2nd dose back in March would still be adequately protected today, particularly against the variants, is what Stefan would like to know.
Yeah, so that we don't know with high certainty. What we are looking at very closely is the idea of immune waning or waning immunity over time. We definitely see this with other types of vaccines against other infectious agents. We don't really know a few things. We don't know what level of antibody or what level of T-cell immunity in the body is sufficient to say, oh yeah, you're protected. And that's against any COVID variant or non-variant of concern. So it's hard to really determine at what point we say we lose that. And it probably is something that depends on, who you are, what your comorbidities are, what your age is, whether or not you're immune compromised. So I think that's a difficult question to answer. What some of the early data coming out of Israel is suggesting is that those individuals that have vaccine breakthrough are more likely to have been vaccinated early in their vaccine rollout. So somewhere in January, December area. And that's like their 2 doses. So those early uptake individuals were more likely to have breakthrough. But it's unclear whether or not this could be because of waning immunity at 6 months, or if it's related to other factors like, differences in behavior. Right. Certainly, I felt a little bit like Superman after I was vaccinated and wanted to rip off my mask, Superman style, and go out there and, get into people's face and go back to normal. So that might be a bit of a driver for those early adopters of vaccine, is that there was some increased risky behaviors going to, bars and
so a false sense of confidence. Is that what you're saying? People may have had a bit of a false sense of security because, well, I've got the vaccine, so I'm good to go now. I can get back to what I was doing, prior to the pandemic, and having that normalcy again, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a false sense of security, because you're definitely more secure than the unvaccinated person sitting next to you. But, at that point in time when there was still a lot of circulating virus and there wasn't a lot of uptake of vaccine within the community, it probably isn't the safest thing to do, which is why I held off on ripping off my mask.
And hugging everybody in sight. Got a question, a specific one from Rebecca, who's one of our registered nurses. She wants to know what is known about the COVID transmission rate by fully vaccinated people. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, so we don't actually have that data either. So what we're seeing, and this is really out of one big series that comes out of Massachusetts, it was published by the CDC, was that amongst those individuals that were fully vaccinated that acquired symptomatic COVID, that they had similar cycle thresholds. So they seem to have similar viral loads as the unvaccinated counterparts, which would suggest that they're probably equally transmissible. But that doesn't take into consideration how many secondary cases they caused compared to their unvaccinated counterparts. So how many people did they actually infect? And it also doesn't really give us a good picture of those individuals that are not symptomatic, that are fully vaccinated, that might have caught COVID, but their immune system controlled it so well that they didn't really have a lot of detectable virus there. Right. So I think there's still a little bit of unknowns in that space, which is why I think for the time being, until we really get a good threshold of immunity from vaccines in our community, we have to maintain our other layers of protection. And that includes, social distancing, masking, specifically masking when you're in a mixed crowd or crowded area indoors, all those good behaviors that we had pre-vaccination. If we have them layered on, we're not going to have any near misses.
It's another edition of Ask the Experts here on our Facebook page at CIE Centre-Ouest. Another edition coming up later this week, une autre séance avec le Dr Yves Lontain en français pour toutes vos questions par rapport à la quatrième vague, retour à l'école. Speaking of the return to school, we'll chat about that in just a second, Dr. Parkes. But before we move on to that, third dose booster, how close are we? Is that going to be a thing? Is it necessary?
Yeah, so this is also something that's being hotly studied at present. And I think, there is the feeling, and there's certainly the plan in certain areas of the world. So one example is the United States has announced, I think just last week, that they're going to roll out the third dose for individuals who are immune compromised and elderly, who are certainly vaccinated early. So they're talking about at 8 months post their second dose. It's unclear sort of what this role is going to play and how it's going to roll out in Canada. I think the committee that advises vaccines nationally, so the National Immunization Committee in Canada, they're still talking about what role this is going to play in Canada. Certainly, if a booster is required, I'm going to be in line to get it.
Let's talk about kids and focus on students at the moment. School starting in just a matter of days for many. Still needing to get, many of those eligible 12 to 17-year-olds vaccinated as quickly as possible. It's been great, though, I think, to see so many teens get out there in big numbers to get vaccinated and get both their doses. But, CEGEP students, university students getting ready to go back as well. They've been getting vaxxed so they can protect themselves and get back to school and all the activities that they love doing together. In your opinion, how safe are kids going back to class in the current context? And maybe, what should they be doing to protect themselves and make themselves as safe as possible? Maybe some advice you would give to parents who are a little bit concerned, myself included. I've got 2 little ones who are going back very, very shortly as well. What could you say about that?
Yeah, I think, moving forward with Delta sort of increasing on our horizon, we know that the more transmissible a virus is, the higher the percentage of herd immunity that is required. And that's the number of people within the community that need to be immune in order to really stop an epidemic transmission of the virus or stop transmission of the virus. So with Delta, that's greater than 90%. And that's greater than 100% of those individuals within our population that are eligible to vaccine. So reminding everyone that vaccine's only eligible for ages 12 and above. So a huge portion of children cannot be vaccinated at present. That might change in the near future. I know that there are like studies pending and decisions pending about vaccinations amongst children, which will certainly help us achieve our goal of getting the highest percent of vaccine coverage. Until then, what we all have to do, everyone who is vaccine eligible should go out and get vaccinated. That is the way that we're going to protect each other. That's the way we're going to protect our children. Because certainly for those individuals, those children that are not able to be vaccinated yet, as our rates of infection climb within the unvaccinated population, namely this population, even the rare events such as complications in this age group, they will become more frequent. So if something happens to only 5% of people, if you have 10 people that are infected with something, that 5% looks pretty low compared to if you have something like 1 million people infected with something. That means a high percentage of individuals, or not a high percentage, but a relatively large group of individuals could be affected by a very serious complication. So that's incredibly important to try to maximize our vaccine protection. This also implies that for those children that can't get vaccinated, if there is outbreaks within schools, if they acquire the illness and come home, the virus stops there. It doesn't really have a lot of onward transmission because we're acting as a big old wall of antibodies that prevent what's going on. And it also protects those that are most vulnerable. So, grandmas and grandpas and great-grandmas and great-grandpas, all the individuals within that household or in our families that we want to protect the most, who might be most likely to have severe disease, we can stop them from getting it by being really careful, by having as many people vaccinated. And then that's where the role of things like masking comes in as well. While we're waiting for that to occur, as much as we can, if you can tolerate a mask, you keep it on your face. You're going to reduce the risk of transmission of virus. You're going to protect yourself from COVID, and you're also going to protect yourself from other respiratory viruses. I don't know about you, but I was really happy that for the last 2 years, I haven't had any respiratory viruses or any flus. And that's because
it was kind of nice that there was no flu season, but now we're coming back to this. And if it's like, and I guess what you're saying too, is even for kids who, if they're not mandated or forced or imposed upon from a masking perspective, if your kid is happy to wear a mask, you're saying, why not wear a mask? I mean, there's going to be plenty around that will end up helping at the end of the day, right?
For sure. I feel like it's like any type of protection. If there's no mandate to wear a helmet, but if you want to have that extra layer of protection by putting a helmet on and elbow pads and wrist guards and knee pads, then you do that. You're not required by law to put those wrist guards and knee pads on, but
exactly
to prevent a broken wrist.
Nobody's forcing you to put a toque on when it's -40 outside in February either, but you tend to do it because it's a way of protecting yourself, I guess. And I mean, those are the questions, right? Genevieve, who's nervous about her daughter starting kindergarten in a few days and wants to know what's holding up the under 12 vaccine. What is the difference exactly? Why does that take longer? Why do the studies take longer to get the under 12 crowd approved for something like a COVID vaccine?
Well, I don't know if I know that answer in enough complexity, but I'm sure it has to do with the ethics of consenting individuals of that age group.
That makes sense.
And legalities and all kinds of red tape that is slowing down the process of approval within that age group.
Let me ask you two last questions about kids and families in school. How do you think the return to school affects the family dynamic? Because I know I've been asked more than once. It almost feels like there's a deadline for families with school starting, where grandma and grandpa have been around a lot over the summer. You're outside, you're having fun, people are getting vaccinated. Now that school's back, does that make it trickier for the elderly, more vulnerable people within your family, even if they've been vaccinated? Or is there a more of a level of comfort going into this school year because of vaccination for families to stay more frequently together, despite the variable that is the return to school in all of this?
I would say certainly amongst vaccinated households, there is that level of comfort because you know that your risk is going to be significantly reduced, even if you are elderly and may have a less robust immune response. Certainly, as rates go up in the community, so this is where it comes on all of us to keep an eye on the numbers, to keep an eye on what's going on locally and what's going on in the schools where our children go. As rates go up, as risk goes up, then that's where it's really important that we start to say, okay, maybe for the next 2 weeks, we're not going to do our Sunday dinners, or if we're doing our Sunday dinners, let's try to do it in a way that's safe, like have masks on while we're in close quarters, and then do the dinner virtually. Those types of precautions can be put in place to help reduce risk. But I think this year we seem to be in a bit of a better place, but it's still one of those untread terrains that at any moment we could find ourselves on very much uneven footing and be on a downside.
Yeah, understood. Last question, because finally, I know you've been in all of our conversations very vocal about how happy, your family has been to get vaccinated since the beginning of the pandemic. We've heard many stories over the last few weeks about how, the vast majority of serious hospitalizations has been amongst the unvaccinated. That's who we're seeing in the ICUs across the country for the most part. That's just the statistics behind it. And many of those people expressing that they wish they would have done things differently. That's been vocalized by a lot of patients as well. Are you surprised at all that there's still some hesitation towards getting vaccinated after everything we've seen and heard about how devastating this virus is, especially when you see these situations in ICUs across the country where people are saying, I wish I would have just taken it. I would have got both doses. I wouldn't be here right now.
I am surprised, but I think I have a perspective that's probably a bit different from those that are still reluctant. It's a bit easier to feel very, very passionate about vaccination when you directly felt the effects of the consequence of this pandemic, and you've been steeped in it for over 20 months. It feels, I don't even know what month we're at now.
Yeah, I know, I've kind of lost track of time too.
And I think, if you've been isolated at home and reading on internet and hearing news reports that might be a bit mixed in terms of the information that's being transmitted, it can be hard to wade through that information to tease out what is real, what is not real, what is factual, what is not factual. It's a very murky terrain, and I can understand and sympathize with individuals that are faced with that and might not necessarily have the opportunity to express their concerns and really get the answers that they want and need. So for those individuals, I suggest, reach out. Like, I'm always here. So if you want to chat about vaccination. And
Dr. Parkes' mobile phone number is, we'll just put that at the bottom of the screen. No, but you're right. I think what you're saying is so important, right? It's the ability to seek out the right information, because there's no shortage of information, but the right information is the key in all of this. So, that's where I would invite people for all the details on how to get vaccinated and about vaccination to go to cuswestcentral.ca/COVID vaccination. All the information's there, where you can go, how you can get those vaccines, but also Quebec.ca. There's a very robust government website that is dedicated just to all the questions you may or may not have about this, to get as informed as possible and make those decisions for yourself. Because at the end of the day, it is a personal decision. But I think what you're saying is really, really important, just about getting informed as best as you can, right?
Yeah, and I think, for some people, and certainly for some of my more reluctant family members, going out and talking to people that they trust also help too, like their family physicians and other physicians that are close to them to get the information that they need.
Dr. Leighanne Parkes, microbiologist and infectious disease specialist at the Jewish General Hospital, like she said, steeped in this for about a year and a half now and counting. We're still not out of the woods yet, but we appreciate you taking the time to do another edition of Ask the Experts. Thanks so much for this.
It's no problem. Take care.